Welcome back to the second episode of the Second Renaissance podcast, where I sit down with artist, sculptor, and interior designer Mika Utzon Popov. I'm Anders Sorman-Nilsson, global futurist, author, and the co-creator of Adobe CQ, the intelligence test for your creative intelligence. In this interview, in this deep and meaningful, dare I say, with artist and good friend of mine, Mika Utzon Popov, we discuss how growing up in a creative family has shaped his creative artistry and expression. We talk about how both sides of his family, both the Popov and the Utzons, have given him both architectural know-how, but also given him liberty to really explore and give expression to his unique Danish Australian point of view. How the Danish Noir combined with the light in the northern beaches of Sydney has translated into him becoming a brand ambassador and an artist in residence for R.M. Williams, building and co-contributing to their flagship store in New York. And just the importance of the liberty of growing up in a creative setting has set him free from some of the constraints of traditional society. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did, and I give you Mika Utzon Popov.
Welcome to our home.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So it's always funny when you live on the other side of the world, and this is something we'll come back to through our conversation today. I'm Swedish originally, live in Australia, and the way we met was that I was trying to keep my Swedish tradition alive by speaking Swedish to my son, and I could notice, down in Avalon shops, a gentleman standing 50 meters away heard me speaking Scandinavian to the next generation. So welcome onto the show, Mika Utzon Popov. You were that person, and then you initiated conversation. So
thank you, Anders. I'm glad I did.
Yeah. No, it's been really a really nice new acquaintance up here on the northern beaches, and I know, from meeting with you and us having lunch up here at Girdler's in Clareville and talking about all things Scandinavian and Australian and the sort of duality that as an artist, as a very accomplished artist, that sort of duality has sort of shaped you in many ways. I'm curious, Australia, you got the freshness of the northern beaches, then there's the Danish Noir. How has that shaped the artist that is Mika Utzon Popov?
Yeah, it's a very fundamental part of who I am, and it's a sort of an ongoing dialogue with myself about what does it actually mean, and I think in a sense I've come to realize that it's a continuum. It's not something that ever seems to settle completely. I think I made the joke that I'm more Australian in Denmark and I'm more Danish in Australia, and you sort of, I guess over the years I've realized that the benefit of having that is a constant shift of perspective. You never get settled or locked into too much of a one viewpoint that you tend to go stagnant with, and also you're able to, if you remain open, to sort of pull the best of all of those aspects out of what you're doing. And I know that there's a tendency probably sometimes to long for a place when you're not there, and forgetting that there are negatives as well. So you tend to pluck out all the good stuff. And I think I'm beginning to, with the ability to have a bit of hindsight now, is I can look back and really appreciate the benefits and all of the positives that each place feeds. And they eventually become an amalgam of things that happen.
I know one of the things that when I've been reading up on your artwork and your collaborations with architects and your creation of spaces, be that, and one of the fascinating stories I read about was just how you use the land and the history of a place, like in Wollongong, where you created, excuse my Catalan as well, Poble.
Yes.
A place, a retiree
yes.
village.
Yes.
But you really you're really focused on how you tap into the place and the materials and the history to create connection and conversation.
Yes.
For people. And again, I guess I'm curious to see how both Australia and Denmark has shaped the way that you facilitate conversation.
Yeah, and interestingly enough that you bring that project up, because that project has a very clear sort of identifying character, and I guess in a sense concept coming out of Spain, which is another place that I've lived in a lot in my life and feel incredibly connected to. And as much as I try to tie projects into a local story and a local sense of place and context of where the place that this object or these intersections or conversations are going to start. In this case, I guess it's a number of things. You pull different components. So Wollongong obviously is a steel, has a history of this steelworks and people who've worked there. So the material sort of became part of that dialogue. But then the idea of trying to create with the architects who were trying to create a more of a social space, so to reduce the loneliness of retirement, I immediately pull back to the people that I've met in Spain, where older people gather in the square and meet, and that's their way of socializing and interacting with community. So you're not isolated. And so the idea was to create that, and that's where the word pobla comes from, which is Catalan for village. And so I think what happens is when you start a conversation with an architect or a client, what I like about it is that you are immediately confined. You've got a set of parameters that start narrowing down your vision and where you can go. And then it's up to you as an artist to pull out the best that you can possibly do to get into that direction and narrow it down to the exact point of contact with context or narrative or intention. And from my perspective, having had so much background with architecture, I mean, I think more than half of my family are architects, so it's kind of a spatial dialogue in our house. And having grown up in the forest in Denmark, which are these very tall beech tree spaces, so there's a sense of spatial connection already in that, and tying that space to a place. And so when I start working with architects, it's often about what are their intentions, what do they want the space to do, how do they want to engage with the user, and then how can I help as an artist to kind of almost concentrate that experience to a more of a visceral or emotional experience than an intellectual one.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by that, idea, and we've heard certainly even through COVID, right, that it's been a type of cenocide, because it's been over-indexing for the elderly,
Yes.
some of the most vulnerable parts of our society, and retirement villages or aged care
Yes.
centres, and there's been a sort of a more extreme version of loneliness when people have been cut off now, not being able to visit their elderly parents, etc., if they are in either retirement village or an aged care centre. So I'm fascinated just to how you think about creating spaces that facilitate conversations, and dialogue and human connection. Certainly, in Wollongong, you guys have done that. Are there other examples where you think, art and design has had a fundamental, role to play in driving human connection?
I think there's obviously art is as broad as, and when I say art, it's hard to sort of isolate it to one thing. I guess you could say sculpture or painting or writing or music. I mean, there's a broad spectrum of connectivity, but it's also as broad as architecture can be. You can have factory construction or industry or private housing. They're all very different spaces. But I guess for me, one of the important things that I think in the ongoing boom of construction that we've had over the last 20 years, there's been a tendency to sort of grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't necessarily agree that that helps the human connectivity, because I'm, I guess, a traditionalist in that sense, that I really do believe that the human scale has a lot to play with how we interact and connect with spaces and experiences. And so one of the things that I try to do with my work is I actually try to embed it into the architecture, or be part of, almost to the point where you won't notice it. It's simply part or an extension of. And sometimes people get confused with it. It's difficult because you're crossing into a boundary where architecture and art start to fuse. So who did what and where? And I've had elements where I've added something to the architecture that later is perceived as architecture, and the art is almost gone in there. But the important thing is that the art is making connection, that it's tying in. And I think one of those experiences that have really tied me to that was growing up with the Museum Louisiana in Humlebæk, which is north of Copenhagen, which, if we're going to talk about significant intersections of art, I think for me that's probably one of the most significant educators in how art can exist on a social basis. It's not a place that people come to visit uniquely for the art, they come for the entire experience. You have a garden there that is interconnected with the architecture and the art. The boundaries are very fluid and very loose. When you're walking inside the building, you have glass on either side, so you're not sure where the garden ends or the building finishes, and where the art, which is inside and outside in the same sentence. That space has done more to ease children into the dialogue of art and understanding of art than anything else that I know. And I love that has that, in a sense, humbleness of scale, where everything is very subdued but very, very clear. I think that's an important aspect of where I think we can take art as a more social space intended heritage, rather than individual objects placed in as entities that you can pluck out and remove or place again. It's a long answer, sorry.
No, all good. So I'm curious. I mean, we find ourselves here in the middle of nature on the far northern beaches of Sydney. As an artist, what is it that sort of drew you to choosing, most likely very deliberately, this part of the world around Avalon and Pittwater, and sort of a place where, you know, the ocean meets calmer waters on Pittwater? Is there a family history in this particular area, or what drew you to this area as an artist and as a human?
I first came up here, as I mentioned to you in private conversations, that my father's Australian, or he's Russian immigrant who grew up in Australia, and when he... So
this is the Popov part of the surname.
Alex Popov, the architect, and he grew up, I think, in Taramara and in the bush there, and then moved to Denmark and married my mother, and we grew up there. And then I think when I was about 11 or 12, he moved back here, and I followed at the age of 17, and my father had rented a house at Clerville Beach. And I lived here through the last years of high school and really made a connection with the nature here. It was really the natural space here, which was so incredibly different from where I grew up. Really, to the point where I was overwhelmed and couldn't quite understand it, but thrived in it. And then when I moved back to Australia again in 2004, my wife at the time when we met was living in Bronte, which is a space I hadn't encountered and enjoyed very much, because it's dynamic, it's near the city, you're in the middle of these incredible beaches. And then as we had children, we both felt a need to be more in connection with the natural environment. And Kirsty had spent quite a lot of time up here as a young student, and so we felt this was a place that we'd like to be. And coming up here, I think, as you probably found too, there's an element of the Australian landscape that's so wildly different to the European landscape. In Sweden, your landscapes are more wild, but in Denmark, there's a subduedness to it, in that it is maintained by us, whereas here, we sort of, I like to say that we're here on nature's premises, whereas in Europe, nature's there on our premises. You feel very small here, and you really feel, and especially where the river meets the ocean, and that whole dynamic that you have in this incredible national park of Ku-ring-gai Chase, is that you really feel a sense of time, this enormous enormity that sort of changes in front of you that you have very little ability to change or make impact on. And I really like that. I've grown to like that sort of rawness of the landscape here.
Mm. And so the connection and the sort of the story of Mika Utzon Popov and the connection with Australia, though, from what I understand, begins with the Sydney Opera House, that iconic, yes, piece of architecture that everyone around the world now knows about, and your grandfather winning the competition to design it.
Yes. I wouldn't be here if he hadn't won that competition. My mother's family, so Lynn is the son of Jan, and they moved out here for the Opera House. They won the competition. They started construction and design in Denmark, and then once it sort of got underway, they moved here, and they actually moved to Pittwater, oddly enough, and bought a block of land in Bayview, and very much intended to stay in Australia and build a house, and that was going to be their future here. And then, because of all the controversy and the problems that were involved, they left. And my mother was, I think, 17 or 18 when she left, so it's a very strong sort of emotional period for her. Had made a lot of friends, made a lot of connections, and never quite lost that contact. And there were a lot of Australians who left Australia in that period, 1967, 68. Robert Hughes and my godfather Martin Sharp and my dad, they all moved to London at that period, and so my dad moved to Denmark. And that sort of, I guess, tied that whole connection back to here eventually. And
then you were born early 70s.
Yes, I was born in Denmark in 1971, and grew up in the same forest that my grandparents had spent there. My grandfather grew up there and then moved back there and to have family. And when they won the Opera House, they were living in that forest. So we grew up in that same forest, which is very small. There weren't many people there when I was born. We were probably a community of 300-400 people, and it's since grown quite a lot.
So I'm curious. I mean, as an artist, and now you collaborate closely with architects, sort of, embedded with architecture quite closely. I know you're also a sculptor. But I'm just curious, just to see, growing up, how, as a young child, with a mother who's a ceramicist.
She's a designer and artist, and again a broad. I mean, she's done murals and porcelain design for Royal Copenhagen, tapestries, glassware, you name it.
It must be fascinating conversations around the dinner table, and you must have soaked up all this creativity from both maternal and paternal sides of the family, and it sounds like you also spent time in Mallorca with your grandparents as well. What did you learn, or what did you sort of soak up just by that sort of immersive experience from a family heritage and I guess a creative perspective?
It's interesting because I've been asked it before, so it's something I do think about. It's, you grow up in something and you don't know anything else, really. And I guess one of the biggest things is that our family has always grown up with the idea that art is something you live. It's not necessarily a career. It's just how you live. And So our conversations were around art, but it was around how, you know, you walk through the forest. It's how does the light fall? How do we experience spaces? How do we translate it into a material? I think I was very, very lucky to grow up in a place where those conversations could run very freely. And I think in the sense that isolation that we had of living in the forest in a small community meant that there was very little distraction from that. And fulfilling your own kind of language and allowing that to flow very freely. And you know, you said, we visited Spain a lot, and then Australia. I think we were coming here on a sort of regular basis once every year or 2 years to visit family. So with that, an incredible stability of being up in this forest that was our playground, and then this very dramatic shift into other places, which for me was more than anything about the shift in light. So yeah, I think just always being encouraged to follow your bliss, in a sense, follow your language, follow your instincts around these things, and being very allowing that nature to be raw in yourself.
I mean, it sounds like there's almost this sort of, you know, beautiful permission to explore and to be free and find that sort of, you know, unique spark and unique authentic self in all of that.
Yes, I think that's probably a very, very, very good point. It's interesting because I remember conversations with my grandfather about what to do with my life, and when you sort of finish high school, and I wasn't ever very clear about what I wanted to do because I was interested in everything. I've always had this curiosity about everything. My friends have been everything from ballet dancers to carpenters and architects, and you know, I haven't had a particular group that I stuck with. And we talked about this, that I did a lot of drawing. I obviously thought about architecture because everything in our space was architectural, and I loved space. And I remember him sort of very calmly and one day sitting me down and saying, look, you just start somewhere, and then you remain open, and you start finding that things lead you to a direction. And once you see where you're headed, you just go with it, and you don't question it. And, you know, I remember questioning it once because you have a lot of doubt, obviously, about things at some point. And say, well, then go do something else. Well, I don't want to do anything else. Well, then that's what you need to just keep doing and stop asking yourself whether it's the right thing. And I think that's been a huge help, is that even when things have been difficult, art is inherently very challenging on an economic scale. It's very up and down. For most artists, it's incredibly hard to make it work. Very small proportion of artists make a lot of money. But that's never been a question. It's always been, but are you happy doing what you're doing? How can you best do what you do? Is to just be yourself. That's an enormous gift to be given when you're young.
Yeah, I mean, I've read stories, and I mean, I'm married to a wonderful woman and creative, and you know, so we think about this a lot in terms of how we you know, parent our son Lucian, and so that he can tap into his creativity. And probably both her and I feel a little bit like maybe our parents steered us in a little bit more sort of traditional paths. And notwithstanding that, I guess, you know, even though, you know, my parents were sort of saying, hey, you should become, you know, a doctor or a lawyer or a psychologist, and you know, and Nicole's parents gave her different advice. You know, she ended up as a fashion designer and as a manufacturer of swimwear and resort wear, and working at, you know, Yves Saint Laurent in Paris, and she's very creative. But she sort of had to find her own way there, and luckily she was able to connect with that sort of creative spark. And I ended up as a futurist of all things, you know, a made up profession. So despite actually studying law for a little while, but I think I'm always super curious to find find people who maybe from the beginning have been given that permission, and whether that's a blessing or maybe even sometimes a curse, whether it can be a challenging thing to kind of say, you can be whatever and, you want, and just...
I agree. I think, I think the real blessing or the real gift you can give your child is to trust that they give them the trust to trust themselves, to know that they will find out if they just really fully commit to finding and following their own instincts. Because I can put all my intentions and love into art, into my two children, and say, this is great, you have the freedom, you can be a sculptor, you can do all this stuff. But it might not be what they want to do. They may not have that interest, they may not have that angle. So the best thing I can give them is to give them that freedom and show them a life of open interaction and curiosity and interest, and believe that they will find those answers if they trust themselves. And I think you'll find too that you are where you're meant to be because of the choices that you've made. One thing has, nothing that you've done has probably been a waste, because it's informed where you are and how you see the world. I like to think that all those jobs I did as a waiter or a cook or a bartender and all that has fed something in me about how I communicate with people and when I work, or how I perceive spaces with people. I think all of that we learn from everything.
And so I am curious whether, even in and because you've got kids, is there any other sort of, from a creativity perspective? Because I always think about this. I'm like, which jobs will machines take over, or what will, artificial intelligence do to, which side of the brain, left or right, that will be more commoditized, and which one will be prized in the future. And I tend to think that, robotics and machine learning will probably influence and maybe duplicate the human brain a little bit more from a sort of a mathematical, logical, computational part of the brain. And then I'm going, but, maybe this is the chance to... I think there's been a lot of people over the years. It's like that Supertramp song, the logical song.
Yes.
Then they sent me away to become logical, practical, cynical, a vegetable. Now, if you're an accountant listening to this podcast, don't be offended, right? So,
accountant, I think very abstract.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think there's been a lot of people that I know, who have had that really strong parental guidance that, go down this career path because it's safe, you'll make good money, you'll be able to service the mortgage. But they've lost that connectivity with, who they are or their own creative expression. Because I think that creative expression can come in no matter what profession you actually choose. So there's certainly creative accountants. There's a lot of very creative, medical professionals, etc. But how, no matter what profession you choose, whether it's more left brain or right brain, so to speak, is there any advice you can give to parents in terms of just getting their kids to really tap into who they are?
I think. Look, I'm not in any way going to say I'm good at it, but I think sometimes stepping back and allowing the kids to show you the way a bit is a really important aspect, because it teaches the child that they're free to also explore and inform you. And I think that leads to an element of discovery of their own. I have a tendency to point out things to my kids a lot. Look at that sunset, look at that bird flying, look at that cloud, look at the light, and sometimes you just need to let them take it in and process it and bring it to you in their way. I think freedom is incredible. You probably have heard this too, that a lot of us grew up in a period where there was an incredible sort of, I think in Scandinavia anyway, it was a very naive period of not naive, but in a sense, childhood naivety is a wrong word. Romantic period where there was a lot of experimentation around childhood rearing, social structure, living together, which allowed children to live very, very freely. I mean, we never locked the door. We were always running around in the forest by ourselves and exploring. I was given an axe at age 10 to go out and build a cubby house. You know, there was this sort of trust.
At what stage were you given the axe?
I was 10,
okay.
And my grandfather said, look, can you go and chop that birch tree down in the backyard for me? And so he showed me how to use it, and then he taught me how to use it to check the thickness for the ice, because he didn't want us to walk out on the ice and go through the ice. So it was, I guess it was a preemptive thing of saying, look, you're going to come into contact with these things by yourself. You need to kind of know how it works. I remember buying my kids a little Danish scout knife and giving it to them because of the same thing. But it's a different world. There's a different, it's a different structure. There's different ways of approaching the information that our children are accessing is very different. I think you're in an incredibly interesting and difficult business of predicting, because there are obviously aspects of predicting that are completely unknown. I mean, I don't think any of us expected the iPhone or expected the change that it created within how we experience and interact with the world, and what it's actually allowed us to do as well. I think one of the important things we can give our children in a world that is so broad, I mean, kids have information access. Teachers, for example, no longer are the holders of access, which means we're not, of information, sorry. We're not the holders of information. The kids can get that. What we can be is the guides as to how to use that information, how to find their way through it and build on their own capacity to construct a future.
Mm. Yeah, it's I would say it's not so much, I mean, it's not so much about predicting the future, because I don't believe anyone can do that, but it is, you know, it's all about always sort of thinking and preparing.
Yes.
I always say it's like preparing for the future, even in terms of, you know, this crazy year of COVID. You know, the author who wrote the book, The Black Swan, you know, oftentimes people say, oh, this pandemic is it's a Black Swan event. Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the book, The Black Swan, and coined the term, or modernized the term at least. The idea being that, you know, up until Australia was discovered, all swans in Europe, right, were white. Something that was a white swan was just something that everyone accepted as truth, right? So, so Nicholas Taleb says, you know, don't use the metaphor of a black swan for the fact that you might have been unprepared for this pandemic. And I think it's like, it reminds us that it's, you know, it's quite confrontational, right? You know, like, but it is confrontational, and at the same time, it's maybe a little bit of a wake-up call that we, you know, as people, we always sort of need to prepare ourselves for what's next, while being, you know, very much sort of, you know, also just living in the moment and being mindful of, you know, when you're out for walks in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, actually, you know, even being mindful to our own, you know, intuitions to go, oh, look over there, that bird Lucian, or, you know, look over there, Aero. Did you see that? You know? I think, it's
a balance, isn't it? I mean, it is a balance. And I guess, I'm guessing that part of what you must do is also inform yourself as best as possible and try and decipher elements of each direction that things can take. It's not necessarily, like you said, predicting one event or two events, because there's any number of outcomes, but in a sense, being aware of and in preparation of, you are able to deal with them when they appear, as opposed to not knowing at all. I think that's one of the aspects actually of living in Australia that's really interesting, this idea of having a fire season, that you actually have to prepare for this oncoming event that may or may not happen, but it's very likely, and you prepare as best as you can, and yet you can't quite predict where or how or at what intensity this outcome. And I think it's one of the things I love about Australians is they have this incredible capacity for balancing this natural threat with living. They're very, they throw themselves in, and hopefully myself now included, we throw ourselves in this great ocean that has quite significant elements of danger with rips and waves and sharks and jellyfish and whatever there might be. And yet it's really about being aware that they are there and understanding what it is and then negotiating that balance. It's not throwing yourself frivolously out into it, and it's not being fearful and staying back from it. And I think that's a very important way of moving into the future.
I mean, all these elements that you're talking about now are sort of, these like iconic ideas of Australia and the land and the nature here, which sounds like it's had a huge impact on your art, and also has created some opportunities too. And I'm always kind of fascinated when heritage brands that are so quintessentially Australian, and you're a dual citizenship now, I understand, or you're dual citizen now, I understand. Yes. But you had this opportunity to work very, very closely with R.M. Williams, yes. Very quintessential heritage Aussie brand, to work with them and to really kind of represent through art their brand in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that flagship store?
It was a very interesting project because the initial reaction from me is, do I want to work with a brand, and what does that mean? And you're tying into something else. And the more I got to understand the brand, the more I like the idea of extending onto something that is so tied to an Australian identity, which inherently then ties back to landscape. Those boots come out of a necessity. It's simply how can best to make something that's not going to break down in this incredibly harsh environment. And the original scope for the sort of intention for the artwork was, how can we represent Australian landscape in our store? And so I really enjoyed the challenge of finding out how can we interact with a store and create an artwork that sort of somehow ties an entire country into the same experience. And R.M. Williams were really amazing in that they had no boundaries as to what we could do with it. They really let me kind of drive the artwork myself, and the intention of that in an element of trust, which is very important when you work with a client, is to have that trust that you can do something. And so I think for me, this actually brings us back to what we're talking about with interacting with architects or other people. I think one of the gifts, which we can tie back another step, growing up with my grandfather and having we grew up in a town that was originally a small forest area where there was logging, but there was also the shipyard was a major supplier of work in the area that we were in. My great-grandfather worked at the shipyard as a director. And I remember going there with my grandfather, and he talked about, if you want, at this time I was thinking about becoming an industrial designer, and he said, look, you need to be able to look at a piece of steel and know which machine it's come out of. Go to the factory, go to the shipyard, look at how things are made, which machine does what, and what are the marks that tell you something about that production. Equally, you could say that about drawing. When you draw with a pencil, your arc line is a certain diameter or radius, because your hand only moves at a certain radius. If you extend that to a paintbrush, it's a much bigger stroke. If you work that into a stick with a meter-long stick with a piece of charcoal on the end, all of a sudden it changes completely how you work. So what I've loved, and what I love doing when I get the opportunity to work with commissioned work with other people's skills, is I get to step out of my comfort zone and my knowledge base and work with people who have huge knowledge in their area and ask them questions that, if I'm lucky, they haven't asked before, and together we can push into a direction that we find new answers or maybe even new questions. And working with R.M. Williams and going down to see their factory and actually see how these boots are made hand by hand. I mean, I think there's something like 140 different stations to make this one boot by hand. It was extraordinary. And extraordinary sort of vault of information around leather, around soles, around stitching, around threads, around strings, around every aspect of this. And so it's an opportunity for me to learn. And I think that's been one of the biggest drivers in how I work, is this desire to learn from other people.
And so how did, like, just sort of seeing that embryonic, emergence of the,
Yes.
this, beautiful piece of, Australian art, which is the R.M. Williams boot.
Yeah.
How did you translate that into, selection of materials or into this creative expression, this artistic expression that came to symbolize the brand in New York?
The original idea I had was to cover the entire shop in hand-stitched leather. I wanted to really bring the people who were in that production line into that store in America and represent their skill sets and their knowledge there. We obviously, due to the constraints of a commercial shop, you have to change that. So we had a wall. We had two aspects to the artworks. We had a wall which was a leather stitched wall, which had a landscape stitched into it to represent that R.M. Williams production of leather and stitching. And then the other aspect was the sculptural element that I placed a large hand-cut sculpture, which ended up being cast in concrete, of trying to represent Australian landscape in an amalgam. So rather than representing one, I live by the coast, so I tend to think of Australia as this. Someone living in the desert has a very different idea of it than someone who lives in sand dunes or mountains. They're all part of that same great landscape. So I tried to create something that was an amalgam of all those landscapes in this big sculptural element that's in the store, so that the first thing you experience as you come into the window or the door is this landscape, and it's the last thing you see when you walk out again.
Yeah, cool. We might have to have a little Pinterest board in the show notes to the show as well. Now we're nearly into the end zone here, Mika. I'm curious. This is not a history question to you, but when you hear the word Renaissance, what images or person or artworks or feelings does it conjure up for you?
I mean, you kind of go back to Italy immediately on an art, but for me, it's this. When I think of the word, I think of this incredible energy of curiosity and commitment and conversations and exploration, and I think all this incredible art that we got out of the last Renaissance, or the one that we sort of referred to as the Renaissance, we're still feeding off that today. And it was really about exploring. I think modernism was probably another one in the post-war World War II. An explosion of thinking around architecture, public space, design, people scale, production, everything. If it came out of that incredibly tragic and horrific experience of destruction, and how do we build a new world? How do we build a better place? Can all of the things we do make people's lives better? And that, again, came down to asking questions and exploring.
We've had COVID, shaping the year that's 2020, and oftentimes I hear as a Swedish national that, particularly when I'm here in Australia or when I used to travel around the world, that, one of the reasons you Swedes are so creative, and, you've got, Scandinavian minimalism, and you've got, the Swedish or the Scandinavian noir, and, great music, sort of been punching above our weight in Scandinavia creatively, I think, over the years. And one thing I sometimes put it down to is, the strange lights and being stuck at home during, parts of the year. We've all sort of had that experience of being stuck at home this year, whether we live in Denmark or Sweden or Australia or the US. We've all had to quarantine at some stage or another, and, to some degree. would you agree, or do you think that we might have this sort of creative explosion of people just having more time to think during this circuit breaker year?
That's a good question. I think you're right in that one of the really primary experiences most people have had is this sudden forced inner self-reflection. You're kind of forced to stay within your confines of self. We're a generation, I think, of people who've really been accustomed to moving about at our leisure and whenever. I remember asking my dad, who was Australian, coming to Scandinavia and was very lucky to be in Denmark and learning architecture at a period that was incredibly creative. His teacher was Paul Kjærholm, the furniture designer. So a lot of discussions around design. And when I was at art school, one of the questions I had was like, how is it that these chairs are so good? Why are the Danes and the Scandinavians so good at design? And he said, if you think about, you're sitting inside a house for 6 months with a nutcracker in your hand, breaking nuts open in the dark. You're going to think about how that sits in your hand and how it works with that breaking. And that can be a glass or a candle. You start thinking about, how does this candle actually work best? Is it throwing light around the room the way it does it, that I want it to do? Does it create an ambience? How does it reflect the light around it? How does it absorb light? All of those questions are from an element of self-reflection. And I think one of the beautiful aspects of Scandinavian living that I miss as well is that the emergence of spring is really the point where the conversations that you've had with yourself or others through that very dark winter, that is the point where you release all of that and you're suddenly in the open again. And the two feed each other. One is a contemplative, one is an acting out. And I think we may, if we're lucky, COVID will produce something at the end where this reflection eventuates into some kind of output.
Yeah, certainly I think we all hope that we've been part of the contemplative cycle, and that hopefully that now is maybe the early parts of spring and the green shoots of an emergence of something new. Yes. Thank you so much for spending time with us on the Second Renaissance. It's been great to have you on the show and talk about art, creativity, and your own story through life. Look forward to many new chapters as well.
Yeah, thank you, Anders. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the second episode of the Second Renaissance, this deep and meaningful with Mika Utzon Popov and his reflections on creativity. If you have liked this episode of the show, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and follow it on your major podcatchers, and please do tell your creative networks and those that need to hear about the emergence of human creativity in this pandemic and beyond. Please share it with them. In our next episode of the Second Renaissance, I interview Christian Westerlind Wikström, the CEO of Maneuver, a disruptor and challenger in the fintech space, and his view on how creativity as part of the cultural DNA of the organization is helping them shape a better future of automated payments. Isn't that a wonderful world where our payments and our money flows freely and of course helped by artificial intelligence? Look forward to seeing you next time on the Second Renaissance.